40 years of waking before dawn. And I still catch my breath when that little voice whispers secrets that could shatter everything I thought I knew about my own children. I suppose it started with the coffee ritual. Every morning at 5:30 sharp, I would shuffle to the kitchen in my worn slippers, the kind Robert bought me 3 Christmases before the cancer took him. The house would be silent, except for the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood settling. Sounds that had become my closest companions in the 2 years since his funeral. I would measure the coffee grounds precisely, just the way he liked it. Even though I was the only one drinking it now. Some habits die harder than the people who taught them to us. The morning light would filter through the lace curtains I had hung in 1987, casting intricate shadows across the kitchen table, where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations. This was my sanctuary. My moment of peace before the day demanded I become someone else's solution to their problems. I had no idea that morning would be the last time I felt truly safe in my own home. Naomi appeared in the doorway like a sleepy ghost. Her dinosaur pajamas too big for her 7-year-old frame. Dark hair sticking up in rebellious cowlicks. She was my youngest grandchild, Celeste's daughter, and the only person in the family who still looked at me like I mattered for reasons beyond my bank account. She climbed onto the wooden stool beside me, legs swinging freely, and reached for the box of crackers I kept on the counter just for her visits. Between bites of saltines, she said something that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. Her words were casual, delivered with the innocent bluntness that only children possess. She told me about a conversation she had overheard the night before, one that her parents thought had taken place safely behind closed doors. "Mommy and Daddy had been talking about taking my money tonight," she said, her voice matter of fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "They said I was getting too old to handle it myself." The coffee cup trembled in my hands. I set it down carefully, focusing on the simple action to keep myself anchored while my world tilted sideways. Naomi continued munching her crackers, completely unaware that she had just pulled the pin from a grenade that had been sitting in my chest for months. For 43 years, I had been married to Robert. We had built this house together, planted the garden that still bloomed outside my window, raised 2 daughters who I thought would honor the values we had tried to instill in them. After Robert died, I had poured myself into supporting Celeste and Vincent through their financial struggles. Credit card debts that materialized like seasonal allergies. Business ventures that required just one more investment to take off. School fees for Naomi that somehow never quite fit into their budget, despite Vincent's marketing executive salary. I had written check after check, telling myself that this was what love looked like. This was what good mothers did. They sacrificed. They gave. They never questioned whether their generosity was being mistaken for weakness. But sitting there with Naomi, listening to her innocent revelation, I realized I had been living in a carefully constructed fantasy. My children did not see me as their mother anymore. I had become a resource to be managed, a problem to be solved, an obstacle standing between them and what they believed was rightfully theirs. The next morning brought Celeste through my front door like a whirlwind, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors Robert had installed himself. She barely glanced in my direction, phone pressed to her ear, discussing some urgent client matter that apparently could not wait. She moved through my kitchen as if she owned it, opening cabinets and refrigerator doors, taking inventory of what needed to be restocked. When she finally acknowledged my presence, it was to inform me that she had scheduled an appointment with her financial advisor for both of us next week. I asked why. She paused, her expression shifting into what I recognized as her patient but exasperated face, the one she used when Naomi asked too many questions. She explained that managing money was becoming complicated at my age, that it would be easier if she had power of attorney to handle the bigger decisions. She made it sound like a favor she was offering, a burden she was willing to shoulder out of love and concern. But I remembered Naomi's words, and for the first time in years, I looked past the polished presentation to see the calculation underneath. Celeste needed my signature on documents that would give her control over accounts I had spent decades building. She spoke about my age, as if it were a medical condition that required immediate intervention, despite the fact that my mind remained sharp and my health stable. Later that day, I found myself standing in the garden Robert had loved so much, surrounded by the tomato plants he had taught me to tend. The late afternoon sun warmed my shoulders, and I could almost hear his voice reminding me of something he used to say during the difficult years when the girls were teenagers and testing every boundary we set. He would tell me that kindness without boundaries was not kindness at all, but enabling. He would remind me that true love sometimes required saying no. Meanwhile, Deidre had been living in the apartment above the garage for nearly a year. Ever since her divorce had left her scrambling for affordable housing. She was my quieter daughter, the one who had always preferred observing to speaking, who noticed details others missed. She rarely joined the family dinners that Celeste orchestrated, claiming she preferred the solitude of her small space. I had assumed this was simply her way of processing the major life changes she was navigating. But that evening, as I watered the plants on my back porch, I saw her standing at her window, watching me with an expression I could not quite read. When our eyes met, she raised her hand in a small wave, then disappeared from view. Something about that moment felt significant, though I could not yet understand why. The family dinner Celeste arranged for the following Sunday felt different from the moment I opened the door. Vincent carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he was about to solve a problem. His smile too bright, and his compliments too frequent. Celeste had prepared all of my supposed favorite foods, dishes I had mentioned enjoying decades ago but had not requested recently. Even Deidre attended, though she sat quietly at the far end of the table, avoiding eye contact with everyone. As we ate, Vincent and Celeste took turns explaining their concerns about my living situation. The house was too big for one person, they said. The garden required too much physical labor. The financial responsibilities were becoming overwhelming. They painted a picture of a fragile, elderly woman barely managing to survive on her own. Someone who desperately needed their intervention to prevent inevitable disaster. They had brought documents with them, neatly organized in a folder that Vincent placed beside my plate, with the casual confidence of someone who expected no resistance. Power of attorney forms, they explained. That would simply make it easier for them to help me manage things. Nothing would change, they assured me. I would still make all the important decisions. They would just handle the paperwork and the complicated financial details that were becoming too burdensome for someone my age. I listened to every word while my phone sat innocuously beside my napkin, its recording function activated. I had learned this trick from my friend Margot, who had survived her own family crisis 5 years earlier, when her son had attempted something remarkably similar. Technology, she had told me, was often the only witness we could trust when family members decided to rewrite history. The conversation continued around me, punctuated by Vincent's reasonable tone and Celeste's gentle insistence that this was all for my own good. They spoke about me as if I were not sitting right there, discussing my limitations and needs with the detached professionalism of social workers, assessing a client. Deidre pushed food around her plate, her silence feeling more loaded with each passing minute. When they finally asked for my decision, I told them I needed time to think. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Celeste's smile became strained. Vincent's reasonable demeanor developed a sharp edge as he reminded me that delays could be costly, that waiting too long might result in situations where I would have fewer options available. After they left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by 43 years of memories and possessions that suddenly felt less like home and more like a museum of a life that other people were planning to curate without my consent. I called Margot, and she listened to the recorded conversation with the grim expertise of someone who had walked this path before me. She did not sugarcoat her assessment. My children were not protecting me from anything except my own autonomy. They were positioning themselves to take control of assets they felt entitled to inherit while I was still alive, to watch them do it. The power of attorney documents were just the legal framework. If I refused to sign willingly, they would likely pursue guardianship proceedings, claiming I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. The following week, Naomi provided the final piece of evidence I needed to understand the full scope of their planning. She had spent the afternoon with me while Celeste attended meetings. And during her bath, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Her parents had been practicing what to tell the doctor about my confusion and memory problems. They had coached her to say that Grandma sometimes forgot to turn off the stove or got lost walking to the mailbox. None of these things had ever happened. My memory remained sharp, my daily routines unchanged, my independence intact. But I realized that truth would be irrelevant if they could create a convincing narrative of decline. Naomi was simply repeating what she had been told, unaware that she was being used as a weapon against me. That night, I made the phone call that would change everything. Marissa Chin had been Robert's business attorney, someone he had trusted implicitly during the years when he was building his small construction company into something that could support our family comfortably. She was younger than me by 20 years, with the kind of sharp intelligence that cut through emotional manipulation like a surgeon's scalpel. She listened to my recordings, reviewed the documents Celeste and Vincent had prepared, and confirmed what Margot had already told me. This was not an unusual situation. Adult children attempting to gain control of their parents' assets through legal maneuvering had become disturbingly common, particularly when significant wealth was involved. The key was acting quickly, before they could establish any legal narrative about my incompetence. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of careful preparation. I met with Marissa multiple times, always during hours when I could claim to be running errands or visiting friends. We revised my will, updated all of my banking authorizations, and revoked any existing powers of attorney that might give my children access to my accounts. I transferred ownership of the house into a trust that protected it from any future claims, while ensuring it would still pass to my family eventually, but only according to my terms. Meanwhile, I continued playing the role they expected. I attended the financial advisor meeting Celeste had arranged, nodding politely while she discussed her concerns about my ability to manage complex investments. I asked innocent questions about the power of attorney documents, appearing confused about certain details while actually gathering more evidence of their intentions. I recorded every conversation, documented every attempt to pressure me into signing away my independence. Deidre proved to be an unexpected ally during this period. She began stopping by the main house more frequently, ostensibly to check on me, but actually to observe what was happening. She had been watching Celeste and Vincent's behavior for months. She told me during one of our quiet conversations on the back porch. She had seen how they inventoried my possessions when they thought no one was looking, how they discussed my finances as if they were already theirs, how they spoke about me in ways that made her uncomfortable. She was afraid to speak up directly, she admitted, because Celeste controlled her living situation and she could not afford to find alternative housing immediately. But she was willing to tell the truth if it became necessary, even if it meant losing her place in the family structure. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Celeste arrived at my house one Tuesday morning with Vincent and a notary, informing me that they had scheduled the appointment to finalize the power of attorney paperwork. There was urgency in their voices that had not been there before, an edge of impatience that suggested their timeline had accelerated for reasons I did not understand. I told them I was not ready to sign anything yet. Celeste's mask slipped just enough for me to see the frustration underneath. Vincent became more direct, explaining that their financial advisor had recommended acting quickly, because my hesitation itself was evidence of the cognitive changes that made these legal protections necessary. If I continued to resist their help, they might have no choice but to pursue guardianship proceedings for my own safety. The threat was delivered with gentle smiles and concerned voices, but it was unmistakably a threat. Sign the documents willingly, or they would take legal action to have me declared incompetent. Either way, they would get what they wanted. They were simply offering me the dignity of choosing the method. I signed the papers. But the documents I signed were not the ones they had brought with them. While they waited in the living room, I called Marissa from the kitchen phone, speaking quietly but clearly. Within 30 minutes, she arrived with her own notary and a folder containing the real documents I had prepared. These were not power of attorney forms designed to strip away my independence, but rather legal notices formally notifying my children that any previous authorizations had been revoked, and that I was establishing new boundaries around my financial affairs. The look on Celeste's face, when Marissa explained what had actually transpired, was something I will never forget. It was the expression of someone who had been playing chess while assuming their opponent did not know the rules, only to discover that they had been systematically outmaneuvered for weeks. Vincent's professional composure cracked entirely. He accused me of being manipulated by my attorney, of making decisions based on paranoia and confusion rather than family love. But the evidence spoke for itself. Marissa played portions of the recorded conversations, including the dinner where they had discussed my supposed incompetence and their plans to restrict my access to my own assets. She presented documentation showing that my cognitive abilities remained intact, that my financial management had been consistent and appropriate, and that the claims of confusion or decline were fabricated. The legal process that followed was swift but emotionally devastating. Celeste filed for emergency guardianship anyway, submitting sworn statements about my alleged mental deterioration and inability to care for myself. She brought witnesses who claimed to have observed concerning behavior, though their accounts contradicted each other in ways that undermined their credibility. Dedra testified on my behalf, her quiet voice steady as she described what she had actually observed during her year of living on the property. She confirmed that I maintained my independence, managed my household effectively, and showed no signs of the confusion or memory loss that Celeste claimed to have witnessed. Her testimony carried particular weight because she had no financial motivation to lie, and her reluctant honesty made her words more powerful than any passionate defense might have been. The judge's decision was unambiguous. Not only did she dismiss Celeste's petition for guardianship, but she also issued a restraining order preventing any further attempts to access my financial accounts or pressure me into signing legal documents without independent representation. The court found that the evidence supported a pattern of financial elder abuse rather than legitimate concern for my welfare. The aftermath was not the dramatic reconciliation that part of me had hoped for. Celeste and Vincent did not apologize or acknowledge their actions. Instead, they launched a campaign of family pressure, reaching out to distant relatives and old friends to convince them that I had been manipulated by predatory attorneys into turning against my own children. They painted themselves as victims of my paranoia and selfishness, as loving children who had been unjustly accused of trying to help their aging mother. But I had learned to recognize manipulation by then, and their tactics no longer worked on me. I changed my phone number and installed security cameras around the property. I established clear boundaries about visits and communications, requiring advance notice and specific purposes for any contact. Most importantly, I stopped feeling guilty about protecting myself from people who had proven they could not be trusted with my vulnerability. The loneliness was harder to manage than I had anticipated. For months, I would catch myself picking up the phone to call Celeste about small things, only to remember that our relationship no longer existed in the form it once had. I missed having a daughter to share daily observations with, Someone who might care about the first tomatoes ripening in the garden, or the family of cardinals that had built a nest in the oak tree. But slowly, other relationships began to fill some of that space. Margot and I grew closer, bonding over our shared experience of surviving family betrayal. I reconnected with neighbors I had neglected during the years when my children had consumed so much of my emotional energy. I joined a book club at the library and discovered that I had opinions and interests that had nothing to do with being someone's mother or grandmother. Meanwhile, Naomi's visits became more precious and complex. Celeste used her access to her daughter as a form of emotional leverage, sometimes bringing Naomi by unannounced and leaving her for hours while attending to other business. During these visits, I had to be careful not to burden a child with adult conflicts, while also protecting both of us from being drawn back into unhealthy patterns. Naomi seemed to sense the change in family dynamics without fully understanding the cause. She asked fewer questions about why Mommy and Daddy seemed angry all the time, why we could not all have dinner together anymore, why I had moved her favorite books and toys to a locked cabinet that only I could access. I answered her questions honestly, but age-appropriately, explaining that sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that take time to resolve, and that my love for her had not changed, even though some other things in our family had. The first year after the legal proceedings was marked by a series of small tests and boundary violations. Celeste would show up, unannounced, claiming to have left something important in the house during her last visit. Vincent would call during dinner time, his voice friendly and casual, as he asked about my health and daily activities, fishing for information that might suggest I was struggling to manage on my own. They seemed to believe that if they waited long enough, I would forget what had happened and allow them back into their previous roles in my life. I did not forget. But I also did not waste energy on anger or the desire for revenge. Instead, I focused on building something new from the pieces of my life that remained intact. I sold the large house that had become too full of complicated memories and moved to a smaller place on the other side of town. A cottage with a manageable garden and no room for family members who might overstay their welcome. Deidre helped with the move, her practical nature making her an ideal companion for the process of deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. She had found her own apartment by then, but we had grown closer during the months of family crisis. She understood the relief of being free from Celeste's expectations and demands, and we developed a comfortable friendship based on shared understanding rather than obligation. The new house became a reflection of who I was when I was not trying to be who everyone else needed me to be. I painted the walls colors I had always wanted, but had never chosen, because Robert preferred neutral tones. I bought furniture that fit my body and my preferences, rather than maintaining the formal living room that existed primarily for entertaining people who rarely visited. I filled the space with books and music and plants, creating an environment that nourished me rather than impressing others. Naomi's visits to the new house were different. Without the pressure of family dynamics and the expectation of maintaining relationships that no longer functioned, we could simply enjoy each other's company. She helped me plant herbs in the kitchen garden. I learned to make cookies from scratch, and spent hours reading in the sunny alcove I had created just for her. These visits felt pure in a way that family gatherings had not felt for years. 2 years have passed since that morning, when a fire's 7-year-old girl's innocent words exposed the fault lines running through my family foundation. I wake up now at 6 instead of 5:30, and I drink my coffee from a mug that I chose because I liked its shape and color, not because it matched a set or fulfilled someone else's expectations of how my kitchen should look. The financial security I protected by refusing to sign away my independence has allowed me to live comfortably while also supporting causes I care about. I volunteer at the Literacy Center downtown, teaching adults to read with the same patience I once reserved for helping my children with homework. I have traveled to places Robert and I always planned to visit, but never found time for when we were busy building other people's dreams. Celeste and Vincent's financial struggles continued, and perhaps intensified, after losing access to my resources. But these are consequences of their own choices rather than problems I am responsible for solving. I learned to distinguish between love and enablement, between supporting family members and allowing myself to be exploited by them. The relationship with Celeste remains severed, perhaps permanently. She has made no effort to repair the damage or acknowledge her role in creating it. Vincent occasionally sends cards on holidays, generic greetings that feel more like marketing materials than genuine communication. I respond politely but briefly, maintaining civility without encouraging further contact. Dedra stops by for coffee most Sunday mornings, and we sit in comfortable silence interrupted by observations about books we are reading or changes in the neighborhood. She never asks about Celeste, and I never volunteer information about the sister who chose manipulation over honesty. Our relationship exists in its own space, separate from the wreckage of other family connections. Sometimes I wonder if I should feel guilty about the way things ended. If a better person might have found a way to maintain family unity while still protecting herself. But guilt, I have learned, is often just another form of manipulation we practice on ourselves. I chose safety over peacekeeping, boundaries over enabling, and my own well-being over the comfort of people who had proven they would sacrifice my security for their convenience. The tomatoes in my new garden are thriving this year, heavy with fruit that will ripen just as Robert always said they would if given proper care and protection. Naomi visits twice a month now, sometimes staying overnight in the small guest room I prepared for her. She is older now, more aware of the adult complexities that shaped her early childhood. But she still climbs onto kitchen stools and swings her legs while eating crackers and telling me about her day. During her last visit, she asked me if I was lonely living by myself in the smaller house. I considered the question seriously before answering. I told her that being alone and being lonely were different things, and that I had learned the difference by experience. I explained that sometimes we have to choose between being lonely around people who do not really see us and being content in our own company, surrounded by people who value us for who we actually are. She nodded with the gravity of someone who understood more than her years should have required, then asked if we could plant pumpkins next spring. I said yes, and we spent the rest of the afternoon planning a garden that would be ours to tend together, in a space that belongs to me because I chose to keep it rather than because someone else decided I deserved it. I am 74 years old, and I have never felt more myself than I do now. The coffee tastes better when I make it for my own pleasure, rather than out of routine. The silence in my house feels peaceful rather than empty. The decisions I make are my own, and the consequences belong to me as well. The woman who woke up that morning 2 years ago to hear her granddaughter's innocent betrayal feels like someone I used to know rather than someone I used to be. That woman was kind but not wise, generous but not discerning, loving but not self-protective. She believed that sacrifice was the highest expression of maternal love, that enduring mistreatment was a form of strength, that family loyalty required accepting abuse disguised as concern. I am grateful to her for bringing me this far, but I am more grateful to have learned that love without boundaries is not love at all, but a transaction where the currency is self-respect and the price is always too high. I chose to stop paying that price, and in doing so, I discovered that the life I thought I was too old to rebuild was actually just waiting for me to claim it.